Hi guys, in this video I will be building the awesome 1/32 Fokker E.ii Max Immelmann by Wingnut Wings. Max Immelmann was one of the first ever fighter aces, racking up 15 aerial victories and receiving the Pour le Mérite after his 8th kill. Max was a pioneer of air combat. The kit contains 7 sprues of grey styrene, 1 sprue of clear styrene, 1 small photo etch fret, some nicely in-register decals by cartograph, and a resin Max Immelmann figure. Unfortunately, the figure had some casting flaws, so I won't be using it for this video. As usual with Wingnut Wings, the instructions are printed really nicely in full colour, with easy to follow instructions and rigging diagrams. One of the best features Wingnut Wings include in their instructions are the fantastic reference images, which you can help to weather or detail your aircraft as you like. So, let's get on with the build. As usual, the build starts in the cockpit. The metal areas were primed with Mr. Colour GX2 gloss black, and then followed up with alclad aluminium. The floor of the cockpit was natural wood, so I laid down a layer of Mission Models Elfbine in a clear varnish, ready for oils. I mixed up a golden woody colour from Dalerani Artist Oils, yellow ochre, burnt umber and burnt sienna. This was applied liberally, as I was going to remove most of it later anyway. With an old, clean, stiff brush, you want to drag the oil paints in the direction you want the grain to go. You can add little wiggles and flourishes to emulate grain and make it look more natural. I added a little more variety to the wood grain by mixing burnt umber and French ultramarine and adding some darker lines in the wood grain. The rear panel of the cockpit was often finished in a darker colour. I mixed Tamiya Clear, red, blue and orange to make a brown and varnished it with this. I applied a pin wash to the floor of the cockpit using my favourite mix, French ultramarine and burnt umber. RLM02 was a good match for the First World War German grey-green, so for this colour I used Mission Models RLM02. The cockpit parts fit really nicely, but because of the tight tolerances of Wingnut Wings kits, please remember to remove any paint from any mating surfaces before gluing, or you might have issue later on. I used Ushi van der Rosten Rig That Thing alongside Gas Patch 1/32 turnbuckles Type C to detail out the sides of the cockpit. The Gas Patch turnbuckles are really nice, but they do take a steady hand to thread the rigging wire through the small holes. The turnbuckles were then hand painted with Vallejo brass. I decided to paint the interior rigging cables with silver. I figured that being inside, the rigging cables might get polished from constant touching. I used some more Wingnut thing to add the control lines to the rudder pedals and control stick. The seat was primed and then painted leather brown. This is a great colour on which to shade and highlight the leather with oils later on. I used French ultramarine, burnt umber, yellow ochre, titanium white and a little bit of alizarin crimson for warmth to paint the seat. The blendability of oils gives leather a really natural look, and you can achieve some great effects with practice with these colours alone. The Photo H seatbelts were annealed with a lighter to make them easier to bend. The seatbelts were then shaped by carefully wrapping them around the pilot seats where I wanted them to go. Shaping them before you paint them is a good idea because it stops paint flaking off when you bend them. The seatbelts were primed, and then I sprayed a coat of Mission Models Dunkelgelb to simulate a tan fabric. I used artist oils to add more visual interest, shading and highlights to the seatbelts. This process can really help bring them to life. The seatbelts were then carefully glued into place with Rocket Rapid super glue. With the cockpit almost done, all I had to do was drop in the fuel tank and instrument panel, and it was ready to be installed into the aircraft. Something must have been slightly out on my cockpit assembly because the fuselage halves took a little bit of work to get them to fit properly. I added two small plastic tabs on the inside of the upper fuselage because there were only two locator pins. This helped to avoid any misalignment when I glued the halves of the fuselage together. The fuselage of the Eindecker was covered in one piece of linen that was laced up underneath. Wingnut Wings did a great job of moulding this. The fuselage was primed with two thin coats of Mission Models grey primer. For this build I'm going to be using black basing to add some tonal variety to the model. I started off with a layer of Mission Models black. For the light linen colour of the Eindecker, I used Mission Models Dunkelgelb and Mission Models Elfbein in a 50-50 mix. As the surfaces on the model were so flat, I decided to use a variety of techniques to bring out some texture. With the linen mix, I mottled and squiggled a freehand pattern all over the fuselage. I also added some airbrush streaking. This can be seen better on the wings later. It was finally blended together with a layer of my linen colour to make it look all more natural. You've got to be really careful at this stage so as not to cover up all your previous hard work. The colour for the upper fuselage and upper wings were mixed from dark grey RLM66, field grey RLM80 and Russian dark olive faded. Although maybe not completely accurate, I thought this made a good representation of the early First World War Fokker green. The camouflage wrapped around slightly from the upper to the sides of the fuselage. I had to employ some careful airbrushing to get this right. The next step was going to make or break the build. I had to find a way to emulate the squiggles and swirls you see on the Eindecker cowl. I tried many different ways to get the effect, and I found this one was the quickest and most effective. As usual for all my metalwork, the panels were sprayed with Mr. Colour GX2 Gloss Black. The next step was to paint some Alclad aluminium on the panels. This layer was really a precaution in case I wore away some of the next paint layer. To emulate the swirling, I needed a colour I could polish. I used Mr. Metal Colour Aluminium, a buffable metallic paint. I used a Derwent Artist burnisher pencil to draw in the swirls. I had to get the pressure just right, so I burnished the paint instead of wearing it through to the layers underneath. Once I finished the burnishing, I blended everything together with a soft brush. This also helped to remove any particles that I didn't want left on the finish. The metal finish is very fragile, so I decided to use a lacquer Mr. Colour Super Clear 3 to protect it. After a lot of trial and error, I was finally happy with the metal surfaces. All they needed was a semi-flat coat to tone it down and make it look more natural. The Oberursel U1 engine supplied by Wingnut Wings in the kit is fairly nice. I did decide to replace it with a Taurus Models resin engine instead. The detail on this engine is absolutely amazing. The only downside is some of the parts are so small and in scale they're very fragile. I used a razor saw attachment for my scalpel to carefully cut the parts from the blocks. I used a 2-part epoxy glue to give myself more working time when gluing the resin parts together. The rocker arms were probably the most delicate part of the whole engine, so I had to take a lot of care when attaching these. With a layer of paint on, the detail on the engine really starts to pop. I primed it with Mr. Colour GX2 Gloss Black. I then sprayed the engine with a mix of magnesium and aluminium by E.ii. No engine is complete without a decent amount of grime, especially the early First World War engines which leaked a lot of oil. I used E.ii landing gear wash to add some muck and bring out the detail. I really was amazed by the amount of detail Taurus models managed to cram into this tiny engine. I think it will add a really nice touch to the finished model. I fixed the engine to the fuselage with Rocket Rapid superglue. A quick note to anybody who might want this engine: the cowling needs a lot of thinning, so make sure you do this before installing it. When gluing the landing gear struts together, I made sure to put the sub-assembly onto the fuselage without glue to make sure it sets in the right position. I used Alclad Magnesium over Mr. Colour GX2 to give the landing gear a dark steel look. I then misted over a light coat of OK Worn Effects so I could chip this later on. I then sprayed the landing gear with Mission Models RLM02. Using some interdental brushes, a toothpick and some warm water, I chipped away the paint to reveal the metal underneath. The landing gear was then carefully glued into place. I used the same oil techniques on the tail skid to get the look of wood as I did on the floor of the cockpit. The wings were approached in the same way as the fuselage. I primed them with Mission Models Grey Primer and then followed with a layer of Mission Models Black. As the wings were such a large and integral part of the model, I really needed to up my game with tonal variation. The streaking on the fuselage and wings helped to give the fabric a more realistic look. Just like any other airbrush effect, it's best to build this up in layers. If you build up the effect too much, you run the risk of it not looking natural and ruining your paint finish. Just like on the fuselage, I blended it all in with a light layer of the base coat. I went a little bit too heavy with my blend coat, so I decided to reinstate some of the streaking. The process was repeated on the upper wings with my custom mix of early World War I Fokker grey. I added a little more tonal variation with the R Tool Texture Effects Mini and darkened versions of the base coats. I sealed all the paintwork in with Alclad Aqua Gloss, ready for decals. As the decals with the German crosses on were so large, I decided to give them a little bit more purchase with Mr. Mark's Setter Neo. Once the decals were applied, I sealed them in with a layer of Alclad Aqua Gloss and then a thin layer of Winsor & Newton Artist Matte Varnish. The fit on the wings was very tight, so I had to make sure to be very careful not to damage any of the previous sections of the build. I recommend a slower setting glue for this, like Mr. Hobby Mr. Cement Deluxe. It gives you just a little bit more working time. I decided to replace the kit machine gun with a Spandau Early MG08 by Gaspatch. The detail on these Gaspatch machine guns are really good. The main body of the gun is moulded in one piece, including the cooling sleeve. All you have to do is add the barrel and the sight. I painted the machine gun with Mr. Colour GX2 and Alclad Gunmetal. With the machine gun added, it was time to gloss the model with Alclad Aquagloss, ready for washes and weathering. I used AK panel liner for green and brown camouflage to accentuate the rib tapes. Over the large white sections of the decals, I used AK panel liner for grey and blue camo. This more neutral colour stopped the dirt from looking too stark. Once the AK panel liners had dried, I removed most of them with white spirit and a soft brush. As you can see, the more wash I removed, the better the finish started to look. I made a pin wash from burnt umber and French ultramarine artist oils to add depth to the details on the cowl. I used burnt umber, French ultramarine, yellow ochre and white artist oils to make dirty, grimy and mucky stains on the fuselage. This was applied fairly heavily and then blended in with a soft brush to increase the tonal variation on the fuselage. This weathering effect works best over a matte finish. I used the same method on the wings. I used the included Wingnut wings reference pictures to work out where the grime would build up on the actual aircraft. From looking at the references, these aircraft were pretty plastered, so I really went to town here. The blending stage on this is really important. It really brings the oil weathering together and gives you nice variation across the whole model. I used more earthy and muddy colours on the underside of the aircraft to simulate the mud and muck that they would collect. The laminations on the propeller were painted in Vallejo acrylics before I layered oil paints over the top. I used the same method as seen earlier in the build to get the wood grain on the propeller. As the propeller is highly visible in any aircraft build, I decided to take extra care to make sure the grain looked natural and fine. I decided to add some darker streaks to the wood grain with a mix of burnt umber and French ultramarine. In the photos I have seen, the propeller on the Eindecker looked really dark. I used a mix of Tamiya clear, orange, red and blue to make a dark brown in which to coat the propeller. Next up was the rigging. I used gas patch metal turnbuckles albatross type for this. These originally came with a little ball to fit into albatross type aircraft. I snapped this off and glued them carefully into the places supplied by Wingnut wings. When doing this, make sure to glue them at the right angle. If they're not placed correctly, it can look really unnatural. For the rigging wires on this aircraft, I used Ushi van der Rosten Rig That Thing. I used Deluxe Materials Rocket Rapid Superglue to glue the rigging wires into place. When rigging the turnbuckles, I carefully fed the rigging wire through the hole. It was then pulled taut and a drop of superglue was applied near to the turnbuckle. The cord was then folded over on itself, glued in place and trimmed to fit. With a little bit of patience and some fine tweezers, this process was actually fairly simple. I repeated this process for all the other turnbuckles and attachment points. I glued the propeller on and the build was done. I'm really pleased with how this build turned out. The Wingnut wings kit went together really nicely. The Taurus engine was fantastic and the gas patch gun added a little bit of extra detail to the top of the cowl. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. You can also find my work on Facebook/LPJ Models and Instagram LPJ Models. Let me know what things you'd like to see in future videos in the comments. Thanks for watching.